the long-lasting echo of the Arab Spring. This is how the current events in Syria can be described. The coalition of anti-government forces led by the radical group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is loudly celebrating victory. In less than 2 weeks, they managed to capture all major cities in the country, including the capital Damascus, and declare themselves the new authority. Rebel leader al-Julani promised to prevent chaos and armed crimes. But the country has suddenly plunged into a bloody chaos. In Damascus and other major cities, looting is rampant, especially targeting the presidential palace and embassy buildings. There is gunfire on the streets and mass demolition of monuments from the past era. Hundreds of prisoners are being released from jails, including many ISIS militants. But the most terrifying are the brutal mass executions not only of former officials, but also of religious and ethnic minorities. Social media is flooded with dozens of gruesome videos of military personnel who served under Assad being killed.
We saw this in Libya, we saw this in Iraq. In Iraq, at least there were occupying forces that somewhat maintained peace in certain areas and diverted attention to the Americans. But in Syria, that won't happen.
The wave of horrific footage gives grounds to speak of the beginning of another round of civil war. The groups that have come to power are in conflict with each other, and their rivalry will intensify as they divide territories and resources.
There is a lot of information about executions, killings, and extrajudicial punishments of people disliked by these new rulers, not even an organization, but an environment, let's say, because there are many non-compliant organizations and groups acting at their own risk. Overall, of course, there is a settling of scores going on now, and how long it will last is hard to say, but probably tens of thousands of people have already been killed.
The opposition that seized power in Syria has begun forming a temporary government. Ministers from the previous cabinet are still performing their duties. President Bashar Assad has left the country and received asylum in Russia. His prime minister until March 1st is Mohammed al-Bashir, a comrade of al-Julani. He named security control and ensuring a peaceful transition of power as priorities. In reality, of course, this is an almost impossible task. And the way the first government meeting was conducted is an example of that. Participants disagreed on a number of issues, mainly the distribution of funding in controlled provinces. And fists became the main argument. If weapons were allowed in the room, they would almost certainly have been used.
Islamists will always remain Islamists. As for Syria's future, we see that there is no unified authority in Syria, and it is unlikely to be established. The most likely scenario for Syria is its transformation into something like Libya, where there will be a war of all against all with enormous casualties.
Oil and gas are what the U.S. has been terrorizing the Middle East for decades. The absence of strong legitimate power and a war of all against all is not an obstacle for American business. It was like this in Libya, and now the beginnings of this are in Syria. The country is too tempting a peace, and now everyone wants a slice of the Syrian pie. Under the pretext of fighting ISIS, the U.S. has already carried out about 100 precision airstrikes, and now they control almost 100% of Syria's oil production.
Syria is the cornerstone of the entire Middle East. It has simply collapsed like a blown-up bridge, creating huge new threats and opportunities that everyone in the region will exploit and respond to.
Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is recognized as a terrorist organization in many countries. In the U.S., a reward of $10 million was announced for its leader al-Julani. Nevertheless, Washington supplied the group with weapons and helped with combat tactics. Today, Julani freely gives interviews to CNN, and this is despite the State Department keeping the reward announcement in force.
We all know that the main beneficiary in this whole story is the United States of America. These are not just some baseless accusations or empty claims. There are facts. The fact is that the opposition that came to power in Damascus was financially and militarily supported exclusively by the Americans.
Washington and Ankara have their own plans for Syria. Secretary of State Blinken managed to fly to Turkey for talks. after which he stated that the two countries reached an agreement on the vision for Syria's future. Beautiful phrases behind which lie banal interventions and annexations of territories. But so far, Israel has taken the most advantage of the collapse of statehood. For the first time in 50 years, it invaded Syrian territory. Airstrikes by 300 fighter jets are the largest in the history of the country's air force. And the reward was the Golan Heights.
We control these territories and ensure our security, which in turn guarantees our sovereignty. This historical recognition takes on special significance today, and we must emphasize its importance. The Golan Heights will always remain an integral part of the State of Israel.
However, the Israeli army did not stop there and moved further into what is actually Syrian land. They reached almost to Damascus, strikes on hundreds of military targets. Nearly 90% of air defense systems and 80% of the Syrian army's firing positions, dozens of fighter jets, and the Navy were disabled. Support from the U.S. arrived almost immediately.
The Syrian army left its positions, creating a potential vacuum that could be filled by terrorist groups.
In reality, Tel Aviv cleared the way for strikes on Tehran's nuclear facilities. Netanyahu has already stated that peace with a free Iran will happen sooner than many think. American media seriously consider that Washington might carry out similar strikes, and here the Syrian mess becomes a larger Middle Eastern one. Olga Davidovich on the main broadcast.